Now lesson 8 and 9, it's two things, but it's only one set of notes because lesson 9 is a lab that we will do. In lesson 8 and 9, we are going to talk about what controls your heartbeat and a bunch of technologies and measurements and tools that we can use to assess if someone's heart is beating and other measurements that we can take about your circulatory system. We'll go over a couple of disorders, certainly not all of them, but a few of the big ones. And then at the end of the block, I will mention the lab that we're going to do because you'll start working on it tomorrow. So the first thing that we will talk about is the regulation of your heartbeat. Now there is a picture there, and I'm putting it there so that I can have a visual representation. There are a bunch of words on the picture. Not every single one of them is one that you need to know. First thing you need to know is that your heart has a built-in conduction system. By conduction, we mean electrical signals. And that means that there are nerves. So your nervous system, which you would discuss at length in Biology 30 if you take it, is based on the transmission of electrical signals along the length of a neuron. So these nerves that are in your heart function based on electricity, essentially. You have enough electricity in you to light up a little Christmas light bulb, give or take a little bit. But there is electricity. That is what is making these nerves function. So just as a note of interest, I will mention the use of paddles. I'm sure that either in person or on TV, you have at some point seen someone take a paddle in each hand, put them on the chest of a person whose heart has stopped beating, say clear so that no one else is touching them so they don't get electrocuted, and then they charge the machine and they give a shock. The idea with paddles is that if the heart has stopped beating, giving a big electrical jump could, like you would jumpstart a car, jumpstart the person's heart. Yes. Well, I mean, but the principle is the same. If the battery dies in your car, you need someone to jumpstart your car by giving electrical input. And if your heart stops beating, you need someone to jumpstart your heart. Yes? If the person's heart was beating properly and you got an electrical shock from that or from anything else that could give you an electrical shock, that could stop your heart from beating. It might not do anything, like it might just cause a little change in the beat and you might be able to recover, but if it's a big enough shock, it could stop your heart. So there are two pieces on the heart that are really involved with transmitting this nervous electrical signal. The first is the sinoatrial, S for sino, A for atrial, so the SA node. Unless I ask you, what does SA stand for, you can feel free to call it the SA node. That will be acceptable. I will know what you are talking about. So the sinoatrial, or SA node, on the picture is up here. A node isn't some weird growth, which is what someone thought it was when I talked about it the first time. A node is just like a collection of things. So for example, you have lymph nodes. There you have some in your neck. I mentioned them the other day. They're just a place where things can collect. So a node is just a collection of nerves. And if you notice, they branch out. So they branch out, branch out. Now, the SA node, the sinoatrial node, has the word atria in it. So obviously it's in your atria. The sino part at the beginning is for the word sinus. A sinus is just a cavity, basically. You have nasal sinuses. So that's where that word comes from. This node is the piece of nerve tissue that starts each cardiac cycle. We call this the pacemaker. If someone were to have an artificial pacemaker installed or put in them, it would be to replace this part because this SA node is not functioning properly. So this is the thing that sends the signal to the entire rest of the heart through nervous tissue. You're supposed to beat. Go ahead, do your job. Now on the picture, remember we're always looking at a heart like we were looking at a person in front of us. So even though it's on the left of the picture, it is in the top right of the right atrium. So that is where blood comes into your heart from the rest of your body. That is also where your heartbeat stimulation starts. It causes the contraction of both atria. So you might remember last week or earlier this week, I said both atria contract at the same time. It's necessary for things to be simultaneous on both sides of the heart. Otherwise, the one-way path of blood would get all messed up. So when the SA node is stimulated, there are these little branches. You see one goes over to the left side, some go here, some go down to this next clump that we'll talk about. But because there are branches that go to both of your atria, when that node is stimulated, both atria are stimulated as well, and those muscles contract. So it stimulates contraction. It also stimulates the next node in the pathway. So aside from telling the atria to contract, it stimulates another node, another bundle of nerves. This node is called the AV node, A for atrio, V for ventricular. So we're saying it is the node between the atria and the ventricle. On the picture then, right in the middle of the heart, you've got a big bundle. So that's the AV node. It's right where the atria and the ventricle are meeting each other. It stimulates the muscles of the ventricles, and it does this with really incredibly long branching nerve fibers. So from this node, this nerve fiber goes all the way around each of the ventricles, making a really nice V shape. And then if you see, it branches. All over the place, there are little branches everywhere. This big branching piece of nerve is called a Purkinje fiber. That is a word that I might use as part of a question, so that is one that you should write down. The other names like bundle of His, right, bundle branch, posterior division, none of those things are ones that I'm going to ask about specifically. But that is how your nerves are connected to your heart. When your nerves send a signal to the muscles of your heart, they contract. That is what makes your heart beat. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about the conduction system? I don't think that you have to, no. If you were going to draw something, I would say it's just really important that you know where the two nodes are. So that the SA node is at the top right of the right atrium, and you wrote that down. You need to know that the AV node is in the middle, and you need to know that they're connected to nerve fibers. Now, there's not a point where I would ask you to draw this from scratch, but I would say show you a picture of this and ask you which one was which, maybe. That would be realistic. Or ask you which one was stimulated first and which one was stimulated second. That would be realistic as well. Does anyone else have anything they would like to ask about regulation of heartbeat? So the next thing that we'll do is we'll take a look at how we, without looking at someone's actual heart, could record and measure that these two things are actually being stimulated and doing their job. We are going to look at an ECG. Now, so that you know, everything that I'm going to say here is on page 275. Yeah, page 275 of your textbook. What is an ECG? An ECG stands for electrocardiogram. Unless my question is, what does ECG stand for? You can call it an ECG. It is a printout of the electrical activity of your heart. In other words, it's telling me when the SA and AV nodes are active and doing something and sending a signal. Now I have on there a diagram of an electrocardiogram. That represents one heartbeat. You can see on the bottom, I put the time frame there just so that you had a reference. It takes less than a second for that whole entire thing to happen. So it's very, very quick. What we're going to do is just make reference to what is happening in each section of the ECG. So I'm just going to take a second here. I'm going to get this one out of my way. And I'm going to re-sketch it so that you can see, even I can draw it. So that you can see what each part is and that you leave enough room to write things. The first part of an ECG is like a little bump. That bump is called point P. And you'll see it's labeled P, Q, R, S, T, sort of alphabetical order. This first part of the ECG, this is when the SA node stimulates the atria to contract. So that is what is happening in that first part. So you'll notice when we draw the next part, this first part is a bit smaller. The signal isn't as big. There are not as many nerve fibers attached to the atria compared to the next piece. The next part of the diagram is actually when nothing is happening. So I'm just going to add the Q there so we have a reference. The space between P and Q, so this little red space, no nerve signal, no electrical activity is happening here, and this is necessary. This is where the ventricles fill up. We need to allot some time so that the blood that was in the atria can all get down into the ventricle before it starts contracting. Now the next part, which is the part that goes up right here, so this space between Q and R, this is the space where quite a bit of stuff is happening. Over here, the AV node starts its action. And notice I said starts because it's not finished there. That means that the ventricles start to contract. It also means that some of the heart valves close. When the ventricles contract, you absolutely do not want blood to go back up into the atrium. So at this point, the bi- and tricuspid valves close. Now when the bi- and tricuspid valves close, this right here is where you get the first sound of your heartbeat. So when you listen to your heart and it goes boom, 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 boom. Your textbook likes to say lub-dub, which I think it does not sound like at all, but whatever. I don't make these things up. But when these valves close and blood hits them, because blood doesn't know where it's supposed to go, it's just following the path, this is when you hear that first sound of your heartbeat. Now this section here, between R and S, is where the AV stimulation finishes, and so does the ventricle contraction. So, it takes quite a while for all of those nerve fibers to send their signal to the entire ventricle. Remember, it wraps all the way around. And so in the first part of that is when you hear a sound and when it all starts. And the second part of that big sharp point is where everything finishes. So the ventricles finish contracting, the AV stimulation finishes. The last part of the graph, which we will call T, this is where the semilunar valves close. So blood has been pumped into your arteries, and we absolutely don't want it to go back into your ventricles. So the semilunar valves close. That would be the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve, to make sure that the blood that your ventricle just pumped into those arteries keeps going and doesn't come back into the ventricle. This is when you hear the second sound. Now this is a pretty picture. I can draw this picture. It's basically a graph, right? The first one I showed you had divisions and time on one side and electrical potential on the other. I like graphs. Graphs make good questions. It would be very realistic for me to show you such a graph and ask you things like what's happening at P, or maybe to use the graph and put some of those things in order on the graph, something like that. But to know what is happening in each of those sections in your heart by looking at the graph would be a good question. Now this is an average normal ECG. Obviously everyone's ECG does not look exactly the same. So if a person's heart is not beating the way that it should, then their ECG would look slightly different from this. Does anyone want to ask anything here? So a little bit about heart sounds. You probably don't have to write what is above the pictures because we just wrote it on the other thing. I'm just reminding you that there are two heart sounds. They occur when valves close. One of the things that we do in this section is we talk about the tools that we would use to measure some of these things. So what you should add here is this is what a stethoscope is for. A stethoscope is designed to magnify sound so that you can hear a person's heartbeat. And when you hear a heartbeat, you are hearing when the valves are closing. And so if a person's heart is beating irregularly, you know that the valves are closing irregularly. And you know that there's something going on with blood flow in their heart. Now the next thing on the list is blood pressure. Blood pressure might not be something that you regularly have had measured. Usually when people are young, unless there's a big issue, it's not something you measure super frequently. Blood pressure is recorded as a fraction always. The units, they're kind of weird. MM of Hg stands for millimeters of mercury. Now, if you have taken chem already or you were in chem, you have probably recognized this unit. It's a unit of pressure. I'm not going to ask you to calculate this or change it to something else. This is just the unit that's used. Other units of pressure would be things like pascals or kilopascals. Those you might be more familiar with. I know when I taught grade 8, I feel like we probably calculated with pascals and kilopascals. But it's just a unit that we can measure pressure in, just like kilometers are a unit you can measure distance in. What this is referring to is that mercury will move up a tube depending on what the pressure is. And so higher pressure means there will be more millimeters of mercury that move up a tube. Now, the two numbers in the fraction hopefully are close to 120/80. That is a normal, average, healthy adult person's blood pressure. Obviously, it can be different if you are very tall or very small, if you are very, very muscular or not very muscular. Like, there are so many factors that will affect this, but that would be your basic average. That's what you're aiming for. The upper number is called your systolic pressure. It is always higher. Like you see in the picture on the side, in the systolic phase, your heart contracts. That is when, like the picture shows, and you can see the arrows, blood is getting pushed out of your heart. Since we're going to measure blood pressure in your arteries, when blood gets pushed into your arteries, there would be more pressure. More blood, more pressure. The bottom number is diastolic pressure. And in the diastolic phase, your heart relaxes because it's getting filled up with blood. So it's not pushing blood out, it's receiving blood from your veins. So systolic pressure should always be higher. Diastolic pressure should always be lower. Now, there are a bunch of things that could influence blood pressure. Some of them are kind of hard to measure, like genetics. Some people are just genetically predisposed to have slightly higher blood pressure, regardless of how healthy or unhealthy they might be. Other things that could influence blood pressure would be things like diet, things like exercise. So, did you say salt? Yeah, I heard someone say salt. So there are some things that could cause your blood pressure to be higher. Salt is one of them. If you think about what salt does, it makes you retain water. We learned that in the kidney section. If you retain water, you have more water in your blood. Physically having more blood means that you have higher pressure. Exercise is another thing. Exercise helps you gain fitness so that your body can respond easier to demands on oxygen. So that can be something else that affects it. I'm going to put in here other lifestyle choices. So we're all aware that there are things that you can do that are bad for you. So besides not exercising or eating a poor diet, there are drugs and alcohol that can have effects on your blood pressure. For example, a lot of studies would seem to indicate that a small amount of red wine might actually be helpful for your blood pressure. Alcohol thins your blood, and having thinner blood might decrease your blood pressure. That could be the reason why. There are other things that would work against you and give you really high or really low blood pressure. So, I mean, there's a myriad of different types of drugs that do this. For example, there are some drugs, I'm sure you've all watched TV commercials. One in particular is one for Viagra. Viagra says that if you were taking medication for chest pain, in combination with it, your blood pressure might drop really low. So having really low blood pressure is just as bad as having really high blood pressure. Really low blood pressure means your blood is not getting to all of your cells effectively. There are other things that can affect your blood pressure. Anything that is affecting your heart rate could have an influence on your blood pressure. So aside from exercising or your diet, etc., I'm going to mention something specifically. Caffeine. Caffeine increases your heart rate. It's a stimulant. If your heart beats faster, your blood pressure will likely go up. Another thing that I'll mention is simply body position. Whether you are standing, sitting, laying down, completely horizontal, vertical, whatever, that can affect your heart rate and your blood pressure. And I'm mentioning those two things because they are very simple things to test and measure. And so we might want to consider them when we do a lab. The last thing I want to say here is, what is the instrument called? You might have gone to the doctor. He might have put a blood pressure cuff around your arm and measured your blood pressure. The actual name of this thing is a sphygmomanometer. It's a very long word. I don't regularly ask people to just write the word just for fun, but I would maybe put it as part of one of my questions. If you want to, you can, in a question where you're writing things, call this a blood pressure cuff and just be done with it. Now, there are more than one type of sphygmomanometer blood pressure cuffs. There are digital ones. The digital ones measure your heart rate and your blood pressure at the same time. In these old school ones, you need this and a stethoscope because you have to hear when the person's heart is beating. When you hear a beat, you know that you should be measuring systolic pressure, and in the space between a beat, you know you should be looking at diastolic pressure. The next thing on our list of things to discuss is blood measurements. Now, it's not particularly easy to measure someone's blood without taking it out of them. One of these measurements is not something that you could easily do in the lab, but the other one is. And put together, we could measure a few things about a person and their blood flow. The thing on the left is your cardiac output. This is the one that it would be hard for you to measure with a simple tool. Cardiac output is a measure of the amount of blood the heart pumps during a given time interval. And very frequently, what we would represent for cardiac output is how much blood is pumped with each beat. Now, when we say how much blood is pumped with each beat, we're talking about how much blood is being pumped out of specifically the left ventricle, because that is the ventricle that is sending blood to your body cells through your arteries. So cardiac output is a measure of how much blood is getting pumped out of your heart. Now, if we know how much your heart pumps out each time it beats, we can use that to do a little calculation. The other thing then you need to know is what a person's pulse is, because your pulse is an excellent measure of your heart rate. Specifically, what your pulse is, what you're feeling with your pulse, is the surge of blood in an artery, and you feel a surge of blood every time your left ventricle contracts and pushes blood out of your heart through your aorta to the rest of your body. Now, the average heart rate or pulse for a person, it's very variable. But I would say that for most people, somewhere between 50 and 80 is where it is. Age, size, all of those things play a huge role in it. So does physical fitness and amount of muscle and general cardiovascular health. So if I wanted you to know something about someone's cardiac output or someone's pulse, I would very likely give you some data and then ask you about it. One of the things we can do is we can take cardiac output, multiply it by pulse to get total output. So if I know how much blood is coming out of the heart each time it beats, and I know how many times the heart is beating, we would usually refer to heartbeats as beats per minute, BPM. How many times is it beating per minute? And so I might, on a quest, give you some values. So I might say the person's cardiac output is 70 milliliters. Their pulse is, let's say, 70 beats per minute. So the total output per minute would be 4,900 milliliters. If I put this in liters, 4.9 liters. Now I picked these numbers purposefully because that is approximately how much blood you have. The average person has about 5 liters of blood, which means that If you have an average cardiac output and average pulse, all of your blood circulates your body every minute. So numeric response, absolutely for sure. It's a number. It's a calculation, so you could use your calculator, but you see, I always try to make the numbers easy enough that you do not need a calculator necessarily to do it. Anybody have anything they want to ask about blood measurements? That's a good question. The speed differs depending on which type of blood vessel. So if you remember on Tuesday, I made you all look at a graph that showed that the velocity of blood changed depending on which type of blood vessel you were in. So it moves faster in your arteries and slower in your capillaries and slower in your veins. The actual value then, I would have to check. I don't know it off the top of my head. It would depend on how many meters of blood vessels you actually have in your body, because we know that to figure out speed, we would have to have distance divided by time. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask here about cardiac output or about pulse? So we know what makes your heart beat. We know how to measure and record it. We know how to record your blood pressure and what that means. We know about how much blood comes out and how fast your heart is beating. Connor, did you have a question? No, you're good? So then the next thing that we need to go over are some things that can go wrong. Now, I had shown you this picture, I think, of varicose veins before because someone asked about them. So you might remember seeing this. On the page about disorders, you'll see even if you printed the notes, I specifically left the first one blank because I would like everyone to see it and think about it and write it down. Atherosclerosis is the hardening of your arteries. And I'm going to draw a little picture to try to represent what's happening. If this is an artery, what happens sometimes is that a plaque can form in an artery. A plaque is a buildup of dead cells, broken cells, cholesterol. There's all sorts of things that can contribute to the formation of a plaque. So what is actually causing the plaque? Any of those things that affected blood pressure could be on the list for causing atherosclerosis as well. Now, hardening would be because of the plaque. And you might say to yourself, okay, so there's a plaque. It's kind of getting in the way, but no big deal. Blood can still get around it. You should be fine. Sadly, not the case. What happens a lot of times is that this plaque, instead of staying one solid piece, can break. And so this, let's say this little piece right here, breaks off. And now I have a little piece of plaque floating around in my blood vessels. Again, you might say, so what? I got a chunk. What's the big deal? Here's the big deal. Let's say that now I'm not in a big artery, but I am in a tiny little blood vessel, maybe an arteriole, maybe even a capillary. That plaque would completely block a smaller blood vessel. And so when plaques start to form, aside from taking up space in your arteries, a piece can break off. This little piece would be called a clot, or the scientific word is a thrombosis. Yeah, and I wrote it a bit later down too. The idea then would be blood cannot flow. So here's the problem. Whatever was at the end of that blood vessel, whatever tissue that blood vessel was bringing things to, is not getting it anymore. Maybe it was your brain and you have a stroke now because your brain is not getting oxygen. Maybe this was a heart muscle and now some of your heart has died, leading you to have a heart attack. And so depending on what the tissue is that is not receiving blood flow, there are many, many, many different effects that could happen because of it. So atherosclerosis could be the reason that you have a heart attack. Atherosclerosis could be the reason that you have a stroke. I'm not saying that it is the only reason, but it very possibly could be the reason. So a heart attack, what happens there is there is actually increased activity of your heart because some area of it, some group of muscles, so this tissue could be heart muscles, has not gotten enough oxygen and has died. So if one part of your heart muscle is not functioning, the rest of it has to make up for it. And that could be the reason that you have a heart attack. Now, what are some of the signs of a heart attack? Chest pain, difficulty breathing, shooting pain in your left arm. I know a feeling of queasiness generally is what's described. My dad had a heart attack, so I asked him what it felt like, and he said it felt like someone was sitting on his chest. So he could still breathe and his heart was still beating, but it was weird. And it was like there was a pressure that he couldn't explain just because he had just finished playing hockey. It was weird. And so those are some of the things that might lead to it. Now, you are all young and hopefully still quite healthy, so hopefully your risk of heart attack is quite minimal. Now, a stroke, sidebar, this is the thing I know more about than probably anything else in the whole entire world. This is the thing that I studied. This is the thing I showed you I got published for. This is it. So if you want to know about strokes, that's where I have a bunch of knowledge. Strokes can happen for basically two reasons. Either a blood vessel in some part of your brain ruptures, so it breaks, or a clot, a thrombosis forms, causing part of the brain not to get enough oxygen. If a blood vessel bursts, blood is actually fairly toxic to your brain tissue and will kill it. Plus, if the blood vessel is broken, it cannot continue to carry blood farther along. The clot is obviously the thing that is linked to atherosclerosis. If a clot forms in a vessel in your brain, whatever part of the brain follows that clot isn't going to get oxygen. When a part of your brain does not get enough oxygen, the fancy science word is cerebral ischemia. It is the thing that will cause you to die. I mean, you could die because you drowned, but that would be because you have cerebral ischemia. You could die from getting shot, but that would be because you have cerebral ischemia because your blood didn't get to your brain. Any reason that could cause you to die really boils down to your brain was not going to get oxygen, so it could not keep you alive any longer. Now, you might have heard of someone being called brain dead. And now this is a term that sometimes gets misappropriated. Brain dead should mean that your brain is unable to perform functions to keep you alive. That means that even though say your heart tissue might still be viable, if we were to turn off the machine, nothing would be telling your heart to beat. Now, if you have a stroke, something that often happens, and I'm going to write this word too, is hemiparesis. Hemi means half, paresis means paralyzed. So very frequently, the result of a stroke is that half of your body is paralyzed to some degree. The reason it would be half is that your brain is in two halves. The right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. So depending on where the stroke was, left or right, the opposite side of the body should be affected. Sometimes it's just face. Sometimes it's face and upper body. Sometimes in severe cases it's face, upper body, and lower body as well. Sometimes people would say, okay, if it's just your face, boo-hoo, you can't smile anymore. But it can affect speech. It can affect vision because now your eye movement is not going to be controlled as well. If it affects your arm, especially if it's your dominant arm, think of all the things that you can't do. I know that I am pretty useless with my left hand. It basically is just there for show. It doesn't do anything except sometimes hold things while my right hand does the actual work. So things like driving a car, writing anything, doing up a button on your clothing now become impossible tasks. So this is what happens when you have a stroke. The last thing on my list that we already saw was varicose veins, so I'll just remind you. It happens when your veins get dilated or stretched, valves don't close, and blood pools at the bottom of your body. Yes.
What would be the best case scenario if you were to get a stroke? What would you want to be paralyzed?
What would I want? Well, best case scenario would be the least number of structures affected. So for me, best case scenario is I have a stroke on the left or on the right side of my brain so that it's my left hand that doesn't work, and I can still use my right hand. Even then, though, it's not just motor function that would be impaired. Part of your brain died. And so some of the thought processes are surely to be affected, even if it's just in a small way. So if I want something to be paralyzed, I guess if I had to pick, I'd pick something on my face. Like I could get by without having clear speech, I guess. I could maybe get by without being able to wink. I can't do that anyways. But the farther it goes down, the worse it gets, because then that takes away every bit of movement that you could perform. And so I would say, maybe small motor functions you could live without, but as soon as it starts getting into your arm and leg, where now you can't even, say, be mobile anymore, that's when it becomes a really big issue. You can. So varicose veins could happen for a number of reasons. Pressure is usually the reason. If there is prolonged, extensive pressure on your veins because of excess weight due to being overweight or being pregnant, that could be the reason. All right, so I was talking about varicose veins, pressure. Sometimes simply just aging can be the reason for varicose veins. As you age, your tissue becomes less elastic and less able to return to its original shape after being stretched. And so sometimes just simply getting older could result in varicose veins because your veins lose some of their elasticity. Now, did anyone else want to ask anything about varicose veins, strokes, heart attacks, atherosclerosis? Obviously, there are a million more things that could go wrong with your circulatory system. I just tried to pick a few of the big ones that you've heard about before. This is the last thing. One of the goals in this unit, according to the curriculum, is that we talk about technologies that we could use to help improve some of these conditions. And so the two that I picked here are two that I have personal knowledge of. Angioplasties. I got to watch a person do an angioplasty. It was awesome. In an angioplasty, your goal is to insert a tiny tube with a tiny little balloon, kind of like this. Now, before you start drawing everything, I will tell you that on page 279 of your textbook, there is a picture of what an angioplasty looks like. But the idea is that you have an artery that has some plaque in it. So this yellow thing here would be the plaque. This picture up here shows you, if I looked at the blood vessel from the side and tried to look straight down it, how the plaque is covering up a large portion of the diameter of the blood vessel. So our goal is to get it out of the way. So you take this tiny tube with the balloon, and how do you get it in? Usually, you have to start somewhere that's not even close to the heart. Arm, shoulder, maybe. And the doctor puts it in. It's on like a little thread, kind of. And then they look at their scanner, and they guide it through. It's super cool. Super cool. And when they finally get to the spot where the blockage is, they expand the balloon. So that's what we're showing there. Now the balloon expanding pushes the plaque and opens the artery. Now this is removed. It is not permanent. Once we've inflated the balloon, pushed the plaque out of the way, take everything out. The result should be something like this, where now if I looked at the diameter of space where blood could actually flow through the artery, we've taken the plaque and sort of smushed it and pushed it out of the way. No, the plaque is not gone. We've just kind of smushed it out of the way so that there's more surface for blood. It could. It very well could. It is. And so this is not what you would do every time you have a plaque. This would be depending on the characteristics of that person and where the plaque is. Now the other thing that's similar to an angioplasty is a stent. I know about stents because my dad has a stent. So after he had a heart attack, they inserted a stent, and he said he watched, he was awake when it happened. The doctor put it in kind of by his wrist and guided it up. In a stent, a metal cage, which is permanent, is placed in an artery to keep it open. Other than that, it looks exactly like an angioplasty. There's a little tube, there's a balloon, the balloon gets inflated, but if you see, there's a little metal cage around the balloon. So when you take the balloon out, the metal cage stays. The result, if I compare, is the same. I've opened up the artery. The one difference, and it's kind of hard to see, is that there is kind of a thicker line right here representing the metal cage that's still there in the artery.